Oral questions by members.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier and his government have a transparency problem. There was a buried report on long-term care failures. COVID data that was hidden until it was leaked. The Premier has refused to provide a full public accounting for the delay in declaring COVID-19 outbreaks in long-term care. And now we learn that his government is attempting to shroud a $500 million investment fund in secrecy. Yesterday, the Jobs Minister refused to commit to subjecting the NBC Crown Corporation to FOI legislation, so the pattern continues. Will the Premier fix this obvious blunder and direct his minister to include NBC in Schedule 2 of the FOIPA Act?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the Leader of the Opposition for her question. I just before we give the field to the minister responsible, of course, this is a bill that's before the House, normally not the subject of question period, but that's fine. I want to correct a couple of the points that the honourable member made. First and foremost, she talked about hiding reports. No such thing happened. A report was commissioned by the Ministry of Health, and when it was received by the minister, it was made public. Secondly, when it comes to the issues of outbreaks in long-term care facilities, I think the member has to remember that at that time, as with all times over the past 15 months, we have been working with the public, working with families, working with public health officials, working with independent officers of the legislature, working with people like Isabel Mackenzie to try and find that balance between compassion for those in long-term care who are looking at the latter days of their life and their families who want to spend time with them. So at the very moment we were trying to put in place restrictions to protect and keep people well in long-term care, others were saying we need to open up the doors so that families can spend quality time together. And I agree with that. Everyone in this House would agree with that. But public health has to make those tough decisions. These were not decisions made by the minister. They were not decisions made by me. They were made by public health in the best interest of protecting our seniors and making sure that we kept the transmission of COVID-19 suppressed.
Leader of the Official Opposition on a supplemental.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the Premier for getting up. But the fact of the matter is he carefully skipped over the fact that the report on long-term care failures was actually buried until the media pressured the minister to release it. And when it comes to decisions, a policy decision was made, and 192 people after that decision was made lost their lives. This government promised to review, and it's up to the Premier to deliver so that those families have some degree of comfort. But I'm sure that the Premier is aware that the Information and Privacy Commissioner today not just wrote a letter, but in fact did a media release about this government's latest lack of transparency. And it's related directly to the minister's refusal to make NBC subject to FOI legislation. So let's be clear, the questions today are about a news release that was actually an unprecedented one.
Member, we can only ask these kind of questions in a general way. We can canvass it, but not in detail. We can't have debate on the issue which is already in front of the House. So just advise you.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. So let me refer directly then to the media release that my question relates to, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the BC Information and Privacy Commissioner is urging the provincial government to do something very specific. And in fact, it's so specific that the minister responsible could actually do it this afternoon. It's within her regulation-making authority.
I will caution members, again, like we are getting into the details of the issue which may be on the House later on, okay?
Mr. Speaker, the question relates to a news release issued today. The question goes to the Premier. Will the Premier commit to responding to the recommendation in the news release issued today made by the Information and Privacy Commissioner?
Is it on? Minister for Jobs and Economic Recovery.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And the member may be aware because she was in the House when they created the BC Immigrant Investment Fund. In fact, when they created the Immigrant Investment Fund, they decided not to put it under FOI regime. Now, the member will also know that fund has about $180 million. And Kensington Capital, in fact, notified the government at the time that this would have a chilling effect. The possibility of sensitive information being made public could have a chilling effect. So the government at the time decided that they were not going to put it under FOI, Honourable Speaker. So the legislation in front of the House is a continuation of the Immigration Fund to make it into the NBC Corporation. The members can explain why at that time they chose not to include it in FOI. What we have done is we've engaged with the minister.
Let's not go into details of the issue, member.
Okay.
Minister. Member for Kamloops South Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the questions that we are trying to canvass here relate to a very strong statement that was put out by the Freedom of Information and Protection Privacy Commissioner earlier today. He didn't just write and release a public letter, but he actually put out a news release on this topic. The reality of what we're asking for here is will the government ensure that in the best interests of the taxpayers of British Columbia, will the government ensure that the minister responsible for the Freedom of Information and Protection and Privacy Act uses her regulatory powers to add in BC to Schedule 2 of the Act? That's the question. And in the commissioner's letter, in reference to statements that have been made by the Minister of Jobs and the Minister responsible for FOIPA, the Commissioner says, and I quote, "It would be no answer to say that FIPA coverage is unnecessary because NBC will be required to release annual reports and will be subject to external reviews. Its annual reports are to be in a form and manner specified by the Minister, and external reviews will occur only every 5 years." This is the important part. These accountability mechanisms fall far short of what is needed and lack the ongoing transparency afforded through the access to information regime, end quote. So, Mr. Speaker, the question to the Premier is, will he direct the minister responsible for the Freedom of Information Act to include in BC in the coverage that is afforded by the important transparency measures that are afforded through the Freedom of Information and Privacy Act?
Again, members, the chair would like to caution that any discussion regarding the proposed amendment is the best place at the committee stage, not in the question period. So if ministers still wish to answer, Opposition House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, we are asking the Minister responsible for freedom of information about her regulatory powers.
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And rare is it that I take advice from the minister responsible for the triple delete scandal on freedom of information and privacy. But I will say this. We take this very seriously on this side of the House. I am not aware of the comments from the Freedom of Information and Privacy Commissioner. I will take it up after question period, and I invite the Leader of the Opposition to sit down with me. We can have a full discussion about this issue while the bill that is in question is before the House.
Member for Kamloops South Thompson, supplemental.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The government has a plan to risk $500 million of taxpayers' money through NBC. The BC Investment Management Corporation, which manages hundreds of billions of dollars of assets, is covered under the Freedom of Information and Protection and Privacy Act. The Commissioner actually references that in his letter and his news release that he put out only hours ago today. He says in closing that, and I quote, "I therefore urge the government to support the minister responsible in adding NBC as a public body under Schedule 2 of FIPA using her regulation-making powers," end quote. So again, to the Premier, will he commit today to the people of British Columbia that he will ensure that the transparency that they're entitled to, not that the government feels may or may not be necessary, but that the public is entitled to, will he direct the minister responsible to include in BC under the coverage of the Freedom of Information and Protection and Privacy Act, and do so immediately?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And again, I don't know. I've not seen the document that's being referred to. If the member's reading it all, not just every third word, then maybe there's something to be said about it. But the challenge we have here, Honourable Speaker, is you know full well.
Members, let's have some order, please. Premier.
The challenge we have, Honourable Speaker, is that there is a bill before the House. That is a fact. It's undeniable. The debate can take place, I believe, shortly after question period is terminated, and that would be an ideal opportunity for the members to raise this question. I have committed to the Leader of the Opposition to review the material from an independent officer of the legislature and sit down with her, through you, Honourable Chair, and have a discussion about how best to manage the issue. If that's going to wreck the question period for the Liberals today, I apologize for that, but this is an issue that's just come up. It's before the House, so I'm happy to talk about it after question period.
Leader of the third party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Yesterday, the International Energy Agency released a report laying out the world's energy roadmap to achieve net zero by 2050. This landmark report shows a clear decline in the North American natural gas industry. It says that private finance will now need to recognize that these heavily subsidized megaprojects are at risk of becoming stranded assets. Energy commentators are talking about the systemic risks, including stranded asset risk of overinvestment in gas. We already knew that this government's plan to give billions of dollars in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry is bad for the climate. The IEA report shows that it's bad for our economy, too. Honourable Speaker, it is reckless for this government to invest billions in LNG, which clearly represents a serious climate and financial risk. My question for you is to the Minister of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation. How does the minister justify spending billions of taxpayer dollars on LNG, which increasingly looks like it will become a stranded asset?
Minister of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Leader of the Third Party for her question. The study came out, the International Energy Agency report, just yesterday, and we will be reviewing how its key findings apply here in British Columbia. The report is focused on the global energy market, and it will take a little while to decide and analyze it as to how it applies in British Columbia. We are committed as a government to strong climate action through Clean BC, which includes actions across sectors to reduce emissions and build a clean economy for everyone. We have ambitious targets, including an interim target and sectoral targets, and leading policies to help us make progress towards our goals to cut pollution and support people. So we're currently developing a roadmap to meet our greenhouse gas emission targets and put us on a path to meeting net zero by 2050, which will be released later this year. Emissions from LNG Canada's first phase and BC's natural gas production forecast is already accounted for in the greenhouse gas modeling for Clean BC.
Leader of Third Party on supplemental.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I'm increasingly feeling like we're in an Orwellian universe here, where strong climate action from this government includes the largest point source of greenhouse gas emissions and a massive uptick in methane emissions from fracking in Northeast BC. Meanwhile, the rest of the world seems to be getting on board with net zero. We are going in the opposite direction. Honourable Speaker, the International Energy Association is the most authoritative energy body in the world. This isn't a report from an environmental group. This is not the Green Party that is saying this. IEA scenarios drive global investment strategies and government policy. They're warning that there will be a deep decline in global demand for oil and gas, and that we do not need any new LNG projects, including those that are already in construction. They have killed the idea of LNG as a transition fuel, saying that countries must transition directly to clean energy. And yet, against this backdrop, this NDP government is doubling down on fracking and LNG and pouring billions of dollars of taxpayer money into this folly. My question again is to the Minister of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation. What will it take for this government to admit that they made the wrong gamble on LNG and to walk away from this environmentally and economically disastrous project?
Minister of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation. Minister? Unmute yourself, please.
Sorry, I thought I'd left it on. Thank you very much for the question. The report, which is a very comprehensive one, which is being digested globally, came as a bit of a surprise, I think, to many observers. Certainly that's the view in many of the financial papers around the world as they analyze this report. We have a strong climate action plan and we are pursuing it. Any decision to make further investments in the LNG sector is largely a private sector decision, and the one project that's proceeding, the LNG Canada project, is already accounted for in the greenhouse gas modeling for Clean BC. So that's where the situation is in British Columbia, and the private sector will make its own decisions and its own evaluation of that report. But here in British Columbia, any future LNG project that's proposed must meet our 4 conditions, and one of those conditions is fitting within our climate commitments.
Member for Cariboo North.
Well, Mr. Speaker, after 15 months of waiting, the Premier has bungled it again. Another flashy announcement and more confusion. After 15 months of begging for help from the sector, the Premier promised to save major attractions. But the fact is, it's simply not enough. Not enough to save attractions like the PNE, and no support for festivals, events, and locations that don't operate year-round like Billy Barker Days or the Quesnel Rodeo, and regional factors that didn't matter when it came to pandemic restrictions now do matter for pandemic supports. Why did the Premier draw an arbitrary line that says you are treated differently and only eligible for half the support simply based on your geography?
Minister of Tourism, Arts and Culture.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the member opposite. Yesterday, the Premier and I did respond with a significant investment, $50 million. It's a grant, it's not a loan, it's not repayable, it's a call to action from the sector. The sector has told us that they can't have large groups of people, groups of visitors going through their turnstiles to gather. This has been a call to action from the sector. I mentioned it in my budget debates last week that an announcement was coming this week. This is good news. It's a call to action. It's being responsive to the needs to help. Some in urban areas receive up to $1 million, $500,000 in rural communities, and up to $500,000 for tour operators to help visitors to get to these destinations of choice. I believe it's a good news announcement. The Premier and I stand behind this announcement because it was a call to action from the sector who has told us what they need to sustain their tourist attractions once we get out of this pandemic. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Member for Cariboo North on a supplemental.
Let's take, for example, one of the most iconic anchor properties in British Columbia, Mr. Speaker. Barkerville attracts 70,000 visitors and represents $25 million in tourism activity. They face a nearly $700,000 shortfall, but can't access the full support simply because of where they are located. If Barkerville, Fort Steele, or the BC Northern Exhibition were located in the Premier's riding, they would be eligible for twice the support, not deemed second-class attractions under the Premier's two-tier system of supports. Why isn't the Premier providing support based on what these attractions need to survive instead of an arbitrary criteria and lines on a map?
Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And I don't really appreciate the member opposite's innuendo around this being partisan. We've worked with the tourism industry. We've sought counsel on how to support the sector. We work closely with the sector. I know the members opposite kind of laugh at this idea of listening to the sector, but we're listening and responding. Yesterday was a $50 million announcement to support sectors. Now, urban communities and urban attractions are going to have a higher threshold of visitors. In rural communities, they're going to have a lower threshold. The urban is 75,000. The rural is 15,000. There is a consideration to acknowledge that all the money can't go to the city, because then the members opposite would be complaining that this is all about the city. We are taking a whole of government approach. We are supporting the provincial tourism ecosystem. And I welcome the member opposite to encourage folks to apply. This is a grant, it's not a loan, it's to support these really vitally important attractions so that they're there to welcome visitors when it's safe to do so. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Member for Vancouver-Langara.
It took 15 months for this Premier to get his act together, but it's not enough to make ends meet. The Premier has failed to meet the call to action and has clearly bungled it again. The PNE has been closed for 2 years. They lost $46 million in 2020 and will lose $40 million this year. The PNE urgently needs $8 million just to survive. We've been asking this government to save the PNE for more than a year. And just last week, the tourism minister in estimate said she knew that the PNE had been deeply hit. But yesterday, the Premier claimed he needed to, quote, have a better understanding of the challenges that they face, end quote. Everyone knows the challenges they face. Will the Premier step up to provide the $8 million or not?
Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And I appreciate the member opposite raising the question, considering that I know that he grew up in East Vancouver. I know how important the PNE has been to me and my family. I know how important it is to British Columbians. Yesterday, we made an announcement to allow people like the PNE, organizations like the PNE, to apply for a $1 million grant. This is to help provide relief. I want to go back to the member opposite's statements around the City of Vancouver. It is owned by the city. We are working with the city. We are working with the federal government. I've raised the issue numerous times with Minister Jolie. The federal government's budget announced relief for festivals. We just announced relief yesterday about supporting organizations like the PNE. We've got to work together on this. Governments must come together to support the PNE. That is how government works. I appreciate that this is an iconic institution, the first job for many young people, and it's going to be there for generations to come as long as we continue working together. But for right now, I would encourage the PNE to apply. This is a signal to them when I met with the PNE last Friday. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Member for Vancouver-Langara, supplemental.
This government just can't get it right. Even the Mayor of Vancouver was shocked at how the NDP has bungled relief funding. This is what the Mayor said, quote, I'm pretty gobsmacked about getting shafted over this. The province decided to renege on the federal agreement, end quote. Now the Mayor is saying the Premier has left the PNE, quote, critically short of the funding they need to continue operating as we've known and loved for over a century, end quote. Will the Premier reconsider and provide urgent aid required, or will this beloved provincial institution in East Van have to close forever?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I'm glad that the member from Vancouver did figure out that the ownership of the PNE resides in the City of Vancouver. They have a responsibility to work with other orders of government, the province and the federal government, to come up with a solution for the PNE, and that is in process. We announced yesterday that our part, as a first step, is $1 million in grants. I've worked with the Prime Minister on other tourism-related issues in British Columbia. The City of Vancouver's got to have to step up a little bit here, and the three orders of government will figure it out. But I have to say, Honourable Speaker, we're going to figure it out with no help from the member on the other side, because he's too focused on running for the leadership of a moribund political party.
Member for Surrey White Rock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And since the Premier is quick to get on his feet, maybe he can help us with this one. The Premier and this government does not consider major festivals like Vaisakhi to be anchor attractions. Vaisakhi has been cancelled twice now, and we all agree that we need to ensure that it comes back stronger than ever after this pandemic. We've seen enormous support for this community. They've raised money, they've driven food banks. But now, they need us. And this government has again, as of yesterday, come up short. My question to the Premier, why aren't major events like Vaisakhi considered as anchor attractions?
Minister of Jobs and Economic Recovery.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I appreciate that they have a line of questioning to the Honourable Speaker. I'll encourage the member to maybe visit one of the Gurdwaras, and he'll learn that the Vaisakhi isn't, the Nagar Kirtan is not an event in that form. It's not a business operation. It's not trying to make money. This is a religious... I suggest they do their homework. I appreciate now they don't have any members from the South Asian community in their caucus anymore, Honourable Speaker, and so perhaps they don't have that contact in the community, but they should take an opportunity and learn about the religious significance of this event, and they'll find that the temples do this as a service to the community, not to make money, not to run a profitable business, and those temples will continue to do that important work. So I appreciate the question, but I think he needs to do a little more homework before he asks it.
Member for Richmond North Centre.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. The NDP MLA from Richmond continue to fail to advocate for the Richmond night market. I have repeatedly asked the Minister of Tourism about what support anchor attractions like the Richmond night market could get. They are on the hook for over $585,000 in leases since they asked for help. But the Minister kept on telling me to stay tuned for an announcement. Due to this Premier's incompetence, he excluded festivals and events like the night market from their major anchor attractions program. I hope the Premier can get up and respond to my following question. Why is the Premier denying support to festivals and events?
Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Yesterday, we made a significant announcement, $50 million in grants, not loans, targeted to anchor attractions in urban communities, in rural communities, and for tour bus operators. This is a significant investment to support our tourism ecosystem. There is relief through the tourism grant, the small and medium business grant that is available. It was a call to action from the Tourism Task Force for organizations to apply. I've suggested to the member to encourage the night market to apply for the grants. That is what it's available for. Yesterday's targeted funds is to support those anchor attractions that rely on large groups of people and a turnstile to gather. Encourage our organizations to apply. That is what the announcement's about. It's about investing in the critically important tourism ecosystem. And I want to reiterate that the federal government announced just one day before our budget, $200 million that is going to events and festivals. $200 million to community festivals. Those are investments that we've advocated for, and we're going to do our level best, relentlessly, as advocates to make sure that that money comes to British Columbia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Member for Caribou-Chilcotin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Williams Lake Stampede listened intently to that announcement yesterday and felt that they don't qualify, or at the very least, they were very confused. In March, the Williams Lake Stampede announced that they would be canceling their event for the second year in a row. Mr. Speaker, this year would have marked 95 years for the world-famous Williams Lake Stampede. They contribute more than $3 million to the local community and to the economy of the Caribou-Chilcotin. But apparently, unlike the PNE, they're not able to get a single dollar from the Major Attractions Program because they're an event, Mr. Speaker. To the Premier, why are events like the Williams Lake Stampede left out of these funding opportunities?
Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Yesterday's announcement was to invest in major anchor attractions. It's a grant, it's not a loan. We are going to continue doing our advocacy with the federal government to ensure that BC gets its fair share for events, but I would encourage the member to work with his constituents to apply for this grant. And we will do our level best on our side to ensure that we support these important institutions across the province. That is what our ministry's mandate is to do. We're here to help. Work with me, member, knock on my door, and I will do my level best to support a lot of these ecotourism, these institutions that are important to our ecosystem. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
The bell ends question period.